This is my name, Lois Collins Sims. But you will call me Mrs. Sims. Waxhaw, North Carolina is where we live, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about. I was born in Waxhaw in 1900 and spent much of my childhood and all of my adult life here. So, after a century in Waxhaw, I think I'm qualified to tell you a little bit about it. But first, I'm going to tell you a little bit about me. My mother, Corinna Rawlings Collins, died when I was 3. I think my earliest memory may be of her funeral when my papa, Henry Collins, lifted me up to see her in her casket. Well, there were other children in the house, and Papa owned the W.H. Collins Horses, Mules, and Cattle Company. I think a little 3-year-old girl was just a bit more livestock than he could manage, and so he sent me to live with my Aunt Mag and Uncle Elisha Rawlings near Pageland in Chesterfield County, South Carolina. Now, they were good people. They took good care of me. I even had a private tutor for a while. I think that's when I came to appreciate how important it is to give every student some special attention. When I was 15, Papa brought me back to Waxhaw to the Collins home place over on North Broad Street. I think part of the reason for my return was so that I could help look after Papa's 5 other children who were younger than I was. I can't be completely honest without admitting that I was not overly enthusiastic about that task. When Waxhaw had changed so much, it was not the sleepy little place it was in 1903 when Papa sent me to Pageland. I wasn't even sure that I liked it. I thought, what on earth am I going to do here for the rest of my life? I wanted to be a social worker. I was going to go to college and study sociology and psychology and all of those interesting subjects and go into social work. Well, it did not turn out that way. Although I suppose you could say I've been a social worker of a sort. You don't teach school for 50+ years without delving into the daily lives and difficulties of your students. And when you can, try to do something about them. Well, I settled down in Waxhaw. I went to school at the Waxhaw Academy, and I helped my stepmother Della with the housework and the other children. But even though Waxhaw was truly home, I missed the folks in Pageland a great deal. Besides Uncle Elisha and Aunt Mag, there was their son, my cousin, Dr. Monroe Rawlings, who attended medical school at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. There was Lewis and Sweeter Blakeney, who were tenants on Uncle Elisha's farms. Their little girl, Coot, was a daily playmate. And there was Aunt Fanny, who was born a slave and given to my Aunt Mag when both of them were children. These people had clear memories of the Civil War. I was brought up on tales of plantation life, both before and after that tragic time. Of all the folks in Pageland, there was none I loved more than Susie Hunter. She was a girl my age, my best friend all those years in Pageland. Oh, we had such fun together. I remember the time we discovered a quicksand pool in Black Creek. Uncle Elisha said we better wash out. We'd sink up to our noses in that stuff before we could even holler help. He said there were Yankees in there. We believed him too. I don't know of any quicksand around Waxhaw, so if any Yankees were ever here, they either passed on through or they settled down and stayed. Susie's gone now. She passed away a few years ago. When I went down to Pageland for her funeral, her daughter gave me a box of things she thought I might like to have. There were some of my letters to her. Her daughter said she kept almost every letter I ever wrote to her, that I had influenced her a great deal. Well, I hope it was for the good. You always hope that any influence you might have will be for the good. Well, besides the letters, there were some small gifts I had sent her through the years, some photographs, a couple of books. I sent her this book not long after I came back to Waxhaw, Of Human Bondage by Somerset Maugham. This book affected me a great deal. It's about how a person's life circumstances can can affect the kind of person that they ultimately turn out to be. And I've certainly seen the truth of that in my experience. Oh, how I love to read. Papa used to say, if Lois can't find anything else, she'll drag the chicken feed sacks into the house to read. And in all my years of teaching, the thing that I have loved most is getting children to love it. I've said it before, and I will say it again. Teach a child to read and to love it, and you have won the battle of education. And what difference does it make what he reads? I've had principals, other teachers, parents ask why I allow my students to read anything they wish. I tell them, shall I give him something to read that bores him to death and ruins the pleasure of reading forever? Or shall I allow him to read something that he enjoys? And so he sees the pleasure in it, and he wants to keep doing it forever. Well, Susie must have enjoyed reading my letters because she certainly kept enough of them. Oh, this one was written when talk around Waxhaw turned to the war, which would eventually be called World War I. Dear Susie, I haven't written in ages and I know it. I'm sorry. I've been going to school, studying really hard. I'll be going off to the North Carolina College for Women soon, so I have to. Study hard, I mean. And we go to King Street Baptist every Sunday and lots of other times too. Of course, if you live in the same house as John and Edison Collins, a lot of your time will be spent trying to stay out of the way of their mischief. John got himself out of the house by running off to join the army. He went with Black Jack Pershing into Mexico to search for the revolutionary Pancho Villa. The young man that I was to eventually marry, Henry Sims, served in the war too. He was shipped off to France in 1918. He wrote me countless letters while he was gone, but the thing that I loved most was a postcard that simply said, I'm home. Can you believe we're at war? President Wilson says it's the war to end all wars. I sure hope that's true. We're having a reception this afternoon on the lawn at our house. Well, we're not actually having it. The Waxhaw Women's Club is having it to honor the first Waxhaw boys who volunteered to go fight. Tom Blythe, Theron and Turner McWirt, and Albert Vestal. I'll bet there are Pageland boys who are going too. Tell me their names when you write. Then I can pray for yours and you can pray for ours. They'll probably all be in the 30th Division. They call it the Old Hickory Division, which refers to Andrew Jackson, of course. Now, I know you think he was born in South Carolina, and I am just as convinced that he was born in North Carolina. But I guess when you think about all the North and South Carolina boys who will be fighting together in Europe, arguing over which state can claim President Jackson doesn't seem very important, does it? Back then, we all participated in the war effort. We planted victory gardens. I would go to the Waxhaw Women's Club with my stepmother, Della, where we would prepare bags for Britain, and later we did the same for American soldiers. I got pretty good at rolling bandages, but I never quite got the hang of knitting a sock. Oh, there were shortages of everything in those days. Always something you had to do without in order to support our doughboys. Those were the days of hooverizing our plates, having meatless or wheatless or sugarless days. Oh, I remember those days of scarcity very, very well. We didn't mind. Patriotism was at a high level in Waxhaw, and nobody complained about the shortages. I'd better get downstairs. Martha Steele and Alice Broom are already here getting things ready for the reception, and I can see Mrs. O.C. Cunningham walking across the yard. She's carrying a plate of something. I hope it's cookies. I don't see how you could have a decent reception on a sugarless day. Speaking of stairs, I was recently reminded of the day you and I whipped the cover off Cousin Monroe's medical skeleton and scared little Coot so bad she fell down the stairs. Don't you ever tell Aunt Mag I was a part of that. I might be 17 years old, but if she found out, she'd come up here and make me cut a limb off the plum bush for switching. Oh, Susie, I still miss you to this very day. That train keeps coming through here at all hours of the day and night. I wish I could get on it one day and ride right down to Pageland to see you. But until that happens, love, Lois. My favorite thing on returning to Waxhaw, and still is to this very day, is the train. I love that there are two main streets with a railroad track running right down the middle. I love that there is a west-north main and an east-north main, a west-south main and an east-south main. I wonder how many other little towns in America have that feature. You know, sometimes late at night, I can hear that train whistle blow. It's a sad sound, but it's beautiful too, because it makes me think of all the places I could go. Believe it or not, the train came to Waxhaw not that many years before I was born. The North Carolina Railroad Company. Can you imagine what the people thought when they first heard and saw that train? I don't think most of them had ever seen anything like it. The train brought growth and change. It brought prosperity to Waxhaw. North Carolina had been producing hundreds of thousands of bales of cotton, much of it grown right here and shipped by train all over the country. I can still remember wagon after wagon after wagon piled high with cotton waiting in line at the gin. People began to travel by train. You could take the train to New York City. Broadway was just beginning. I've heard that there were people from Waxhaw who went to New York to see Helen Hayes, Laurette Taylor, Eleanor Adusa. George Bernard Shaw was just becoming known in America, and there were people who went to New York to see his work. Oh, how I wish I could have been one of them. I also remember the troop trains coming through in both World War I and World War II. One car after another, filled with young men headed off for their various points of embarkation. Oh, the people would come out of the stores, they would come out of their houses, they'd come down to the railroad tracks and wave their flags and shout words of encouragement. Mr. John W. McCain would come down to the tracks and shout, "Bring me the Kaiser! Bring me back the Kaiser!" To which one smart alecky soldier replied, "If you want him so damn bad, go and get him yourself." One of my favorite stories having to do with the train took place in the 1950s when the Jant House caught on fire. It was down on South Main Street near High Street. I don't know what started the fire, but there was smoke billowing out of it and flames licking out of the windows. People were screaming, people calling for help, and people coming running. There was a fire hydrant up on West North Main Street, and they hooked up a fire hose and they dragged it down across the tracks to try to put out the fire. Well, about that time, the Reverend Bangle, that is the Reverend F.W.D. Bangle of the Waxhaw United Methodist Church, he heard the commotion and he came running. But then he heard something else. He heard the whistle and the roar of the train. "Oh no," he shouted, "the train is going to run over the fire hose." But he seized the day. He dashed into the Niven Price Company. He spotted a bolt of bright red fabric on the shelf. He grabbed it and he took off. He headed west down the tracks until he came face to face with the train. He waved that red cloth like his life depended on it. And do you know what he did? He stopped the train. He did. He stopped the train right in its tracks, and the fire hose was saved. Unfortunately, the Jant House was not. On a more positive note, plans began immediately for a fire department in Waxhaw. I remember the time I climbed aboard the train myself to go off to college. I landed at Woman's College in Greensboro, North Carolina, right in the middle of the women's suffrage movement. Oh, I loved it. I remember there was a speaker who came to campus who said, "As I stand here looking at you young ladies, addressing you, looking down into your beautiful faces, I can't imagine that any one of you would ever want to vote." Is that the silliest thing you've ever heard in your life?
Well, I happen to know that every young woman in that auditorium had a handkerchief in her hand with the words, "Votes for Women," embroidered on the corner of it.
Oh, it was so exciting. I couldn't wait to share all these things with Susie. Dear Susie, you will never guess what happened to me last night. I heard the great suffragette Carrie Chapman Catt speak myself. Right here at Women's College. She was so inspiring. I was hanging on every word. She said, everybody counts in applying democracy, and there will never be a true democracy until every responsible and law-abiding adult in it, without regard to race, sex, color, or creed, has his or her own inalienable and unpurchasable voice in government. And I thought to myself, you're going to make women come to the front, get out of the kitchen, and do things.
Oh, Susie, this amendment is going to pass. I know it is. And when it does, you must register to vote immediately.
It is so important. Was there interest in suffrage in Waxhaw? Oh, indeed there was. The Waxhaw Women's Club always worked to encourage women to register to vote. Well, they didn't have to work very hard with me. I can't imagine not wanting to know what's going on in the world and be a part of it. I voted in the first presidential election I could after the 19th Amendment was passed. Now, the choices left something to be desired. Calvin Coolidge versus John C. Davis. Well, my husband, Henry, and I have always been staunch Democrats, and so naturally, I voted for Davis. But I thought, what could Calvin Coolidge do that wouldn't be an improvement over Warren Harding? Oh, good heavens, with that teapot dome scandal and corruption in his cabinet and those women claiming to be his mistresses.
I don't want to speak ill of the dead, but who would ever imagine that people in the highest offices in the land would get themselves into those kinds of difficulties? That's what happens when you don't pay attention to who's running for office and study the issues. I always say, ignorant people get the government they deserve.
Listen, I was a serious girl. I knew what was important in life. I have always believed that it is important to remember who you are, to conduct yourself with dignity and decorum, to behave like a proper lady. But I am not a stick in the mud. I like fun, I like to laugh, and I like to be stylish and well-dressed as much as the next person. That is why when the fringe shifts and the cloche hats and the bobbed hair of the flapper era came along, I embraced them. When I stepped off the train in Waxhaw with my shortened hem and my bobbed hair, my father, Henry Collins, did not embrace me. He threw a fit. He shuffled me off home as fast as he could, and he said, listen, no daughter of mine is going to be parading around Waxhaw looking like that. And I said, I beg your pardon, but with all due respect intended, you are mistaken.
I am wearing the latest styles, and you will have to become accustomed, which you did.
Well, I finished my degree at Women's College, and I went out to teach in a little community in the eastern part of the state called Bethel. I managed to get through the first year there, but I was not very happy. This was tobacco country, and they had a split school term so that children would be available to help with the harvest. Papa insisted that I move back home, which I did, only to discover that the only difference in teaching in Bethel and teaching in Waxhaw was that the crop was cotton. But I did teach for several years in Rehoboth, a little 3-teacher school, and then when Waxhaw School was built, I went there, where I remained for 49 years. All this was in the early 20s. My, what a time that was for Waxhaw. In 1924, we got electricity. There was a big dance to celebrate the first night of lights. Well, of course, Henry took me. I had a wonderful time. And I remember thinking, well, that's the end of kerosene lamps, and not a minute too soon. I will finally have a decent light to read by. I also remember thinking that very soon Henry and I would be married, which by the end of that year we were. In 1926, we had our daughter, Henrietta. And not too many years after that, we found ourselves in the midst of the Great Depression. Now, I know you have heard stories, but if you haven't lived through it, you just can't imagine. The Depression was a terrible time. There was no money. Teachers were paid with vouchers, but at least I had a job. I was paid with something. The people out in the country, the people who worked the farms, they had nothing. Of course, it wasn't just the Depression. That excruciating poverty was something they had always known. They would work themselves to death to raise a crop that would bring almost nothing at harvest. I'd see those children in my classroom wearing the same clothes every single day. Old, worn-out hand-me-downs, shoes tied together with twine or some old rag. It broke my heart to see those children. Reminded me of a time in Pageland when I learned a very valuable lesson. Now, Aunt Mag and Uncle Elisha were quite well off in comparison to a lot of people in Chesterfield County. My little friend Susie Hunter, for example. And as you know, my cousin, Dr. Monroe Rawlings, was in medical school at Johns Hopkins. Well, he was very generous and would occasionally send me things. One gift I remember in particular was this elegant little girl's dress. Oh, I can see it. It had a round, large, embroidered collar, dropped waist with a wide sash, leg of mutton sleeves, all in a beautiful shade of rose. Oh, I thought I was the stuff in that dress. I was very proud. And therein lay my downfall. I wore it to church the first Sunday after it arrived in the mail. Normally I would sit with Susie, but there she was that day, looking like an urchin, barefooted, wearing that same old faded flour sack dress she always wore, pitiful little blue ribbon in her hair. And so I snubbed her. I, Lois Collins, put my 8-year-old nose in the air, and I sashayed up that aisle past Susie Hunter and took my rightful place on the very front row, none of which went unnoticed by Aunt Mag. The next Sunday, I had my fancy dress in hand, but before I could put it on, Aunt Mag stopped me. She said, "No, you won't be wearing that today." And she handed me my old everyday play dress, clean but faded and worn. Before I could put on my shoes, she said, "No, you won't be needing those either." And she took me to church, and she marched me up the aisle, and she guided me into the pew next to Susie Hunter. I learned a lesson that day about pride and humility, about respect for other people no matter who they were or where they came from or what they had. And I never, ever forgot it. And so when I came face to face with those impoverished children in my classroom, I did everything within my power to help them learn. I did everything I could to help them find the wherewithal to succeed at something so that maybe someday they could find a way to a better life. I remember Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, the great stock market crash. All over the country, people were rushing to the banks, taking out all their money. The banks were failing. It was a mess, except in Waxhaw. Mr. Jesse Williams, manager of the Waxhaw Bank, wouldn't let the people have their money. "No," he said, "your money's just fine right where it is. Just leave it alone. It'll be fine." And it was. Now, Mr. Williams was a bit unusual as a banker. You would go to talk to him about borrowing some money, and he would try to talk you out of it. He would. I know. He did it to me. I was living at home, but I was teaching, and I wanted a car. I was tired of walking across town to the school, so I went to see Mr. Williams about getting a loan. He said, "Oh, Lois, you don't want to do that. You're just a young girl, just starting out. You don't want some big debt hanging over your head. Why, what if something happened that you couldn't pay it off? You'd be in a terrible mess." And so I left the bank that day without a loan and without a car, and that got me into an even bigger mess. When I told my brother John about it, he had just the solution. Lois, he said, why don't we go in together on a car? You pay half and I'll pay half, and we'll split the driving, 50-50. And so we did. Well, we started the process anyway. We bought a car, a 1921 Buick. I made my payments, John made his, but that's where the deal fell apart. It seemed that any time I needed the car, there was some reason John needed it more. Every night at the supper table, we'd squabble about it. I said, John, I've paid for half this car, and I've yet to drive it more than twice. Oh, I know, Lois, he'd say, I know, but you know, I had to go down to so-and-so's, or I had to go pick up such and such at the train station. Well, finally, I just threw a fit. I said, this is not fair, and this is not right, and I'm not going to have it. And Daddy stood up, and he said, no, I'm the one that's not going to have it. How much money you got in the car, Lois? I told him. Pay it to her, John. John reluctantly did. All right, John, you got your car. There are the keys. Just stick them up your... I'm beginning to sound like some old fishwife. Well, speaking of the bank, did you know that the bank was robbed? Oh, it's one of the biggest things to ever happen in Waxhaw. It was on a Thursday afternoon in the spring of 1955. Now, at that time, the stores closed on Thursday afternoons, so it was very slow. When Mr. Jesse Williams reopened the bank after lunch that day, there wasn't a soul in sight. He took his place at his desk. Miss Hope Sims and Miss Lola Burgess went to their posts in the teller's cages, and all was quiet. Suddenly, the peace was shattered. Two armed men dashed into the bank. They forced them all together and tied them up with wire. They grabbed the money, they lit out of there, and jumped into a waiting car. I don't know how much money they got, but they got all the cash they could get their hands on, plus a few bags of coins, which amusingly, to me anyway, turned out to be pennies. Geraldine Robinson was a lady whose family lived on our farm, and she would sometimes help me with the housework. She heard about the robbery that day on our telephone. Henry's nephew, Edwin Sims, was out at the tractor, and she saw him, and she went rushing out of the house. Mr. Edwin, she shouted. He stopped what he was doing and turned to her. She says, Mr. Edwin, have you got any money in that bank uptown? Oh, yes, I do, he said. Well, bless Jesus, you ain't got none now. You know, that bank's been robbed numerous times. One time with a caulking gun. Oh, I was talking to you about the Depression, which ended in Waxhaw, like everywhere else, when World War II came along. The women went back to the Waxhaw Women's Club then to do all the services that we had performed in World War I. Interestingly, there was a tremendous ammunition factory just up the road beyond Pineville, commonly referred to as the shell plant. Lots of Waxhaw area women worked there. And oh, the maneuvers. Good heavens, I don't think anything like that has happened around here before or since. The Carolina maneuvers took place in the fall of 1941 all over this area. The fields and the woods were full of soldiers. We had communication wires strung across our back porch. There was simulated artillery fire and flour sack bombs, broomstick guns, and beer can mortar shells. Often the soldiers would get to know the families on whose property they camped, visiting with them, having meals with them, flirting with their daughters, as in the case of our 15-year-old Henrietta. But soon enough, the soldiers completed their training, and they went off to participate in the real thing. Nearly 100 sons of Union County gave their lives to that effort, some from right here in Waxhaw. But then it was May 1945. Henrietta and Johnsy were, I think about 19 years old. They had been getting on the bus in Waxhaw and taking it to Charlotte to the picture show for as long as we had felt like they were old enough to look out for themselves. I don't know what picture they went to see that day. I don't remember. I just know it was the Carolina Theater on North Tryon Street that they were going to. Well, when it got about time for them to be getting back, John and Johnson's mother Clyde and Henry and I rode uptown to the bus station to pick them up and take them home. Now, you know that little group of stores up there with the split rail in front? That used to be the bus station. Well, it was a pretty night. It was clear. You could see the stars, and it was warm. The bus hadn't gotten there when we arrived, so we just waited on the street. The train came through while we were waiting. After a while, we heard the bus. You could almost smell the exhaust before you saw it. And as it pulled into the bus station, well, the hiss from the air brakes hadn't dissipated before Johnson and Henrietta were up. We could see them through the glass of the door, just jumping up and down, carrying on. They came out hollering, "Mother, Daddy, Mother, Daddy, the war is over. The war is over." Well, now, you know, Henrietta wanted to be an actress, and we thought she was just being dramatic, but no. They had been sitting there in the picture show when suddenly the movie stopped and the lights came up and a man came out on stage and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry to interrupt the picture, but I know you want to know. Victory has been declared in Europe. The war is over." And they came out of the theater, and there were people pouring out into the streets out of all the buildings and carrying on. People were hugging and kissing complete strangers. Johnson said she didn't care much for that part of it. But here's the thing I always thought. Here was Waxhaw, quiet and closed down for the night. Just about everybody asleep in the beds, never imagining that they would wake up to the most wonderful news in the world. News that John and Clyde and Henry and I had delivered by our daughters under the stars on the main street of Waxhaw. I've often wondered if we could have been the first to know. There was a darker side to the end of the war. That's fact. There was an ugliness to some things, and one of the worst events took place right there at the bus station. It involved a man named Buck Patterson. When the GIs started returning home from the war, not all of them were white. Called colored or Negroes in those days, they had served their country as much as any white person had. But in those times, there were people that worried that men who had seen Europe, who had seen the South Pacific, who had fought and survived as they watched their comrades in arms fight and die. What if they came home with notions that they were somehow on an equal footing with the white people? Can't have that, some thought. And so they recruited Buck Patterson to meet the buses and redirect any wayward Negroes back to the colored part of town. That was a mistake. Buck Patterson was a hoodlum and a lowbrow. He got into one altercation after another, until he finally shot 2 black men to death right there in front of the bus station. Frantic to get away, he headed out of town towards Pleasant Grove Campground. Camp meeting was going on out there. Hundreds of people were there. Something dreadful could have happened. But he went on past and he headed to Lancaster, where he shot one white law enforcement officer to death and wounded another. He was convicted of his crimes against the white officers, sentenced to life in prison in South Carolina. He was never tried for his crimes against the men in Waxhaw. Eventually, Buck died in prison. He's buried in an unmarked grave at Round Top, Waxhaw Baptist Church. In the peace following the war, many things, both wonderful and terrible, began to happen. In 1949, Harry Truman announced that the Soviet Union had detonated its first atomic bomb. Well, you would have thought they had dropped it right in the middle of North Carolina for all the flurry that was associated with it. I can't tell you how many times the children in my classroom had to undergo duck and cover drills. You know as well as I do that if the Russians dropped a bomb on Waxhaw, no schoolchild was going to survive it by hiding under his desk. Simon Rogers had a better idea. All across the country at that time, hundreds of thousands of people were building fallout shelters in their backyards. Simon was one of them. I never went in it. I always figured I was more likely to die of suffocation on the inside than I was of nuclear fallout on the outside. Well, before long, the space race started. In 1957, it was Sputnik, Sputnik, Sputnik. Everybody was talking about Sputnik. Once again, the Russians got out ahead of us. But it wasn't long till we caught up and we passed. Oh, this was thrilling to me. Satellites and space shots and men up there actually orbiting the moon. And then, wonder of wonders, actually walking on it. Oh, I am so excited to have lived in my time. To have been born before 1903 when the Wright brothers first flew, and to have lived long enough to see a man actually walk on the moon. Orville Wright once said, "Isn't it astonishing that so many secrets have been preserved for all these years so that we might discover them?" Neil Armstrong could have said the same thing, but I like what he did say better. One small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. Oh, the 50s and 60s were full of marvelous things, great achievements, great accomplishments. I think the thing that may have affected me most was the end of segregation. 1954, Brown versus Board of Education. I was a little apprehensive about how things might play out in Waxhaw, but there were no serious racial conflicts in my classroom, or anybody else's for that matter. Now, there were things in that time that were not good. It was about this time that Joe McCarthy started his witch hunt for communists. There was the Korean War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Vietnam. Oh, Vietnam. So ill-advised. We might have known that it was a mess that we could not get out of. We should have learned from the French, but we didn't. Somehow, I don't think that we ever will. Hate to say it, but I believe that President Wilson's notion of a war to end all wars was simply a pipe dream. Jesus' assertion that there will be wars and rumors of wars is much closer to the truth. I have, thankfully, attended very few funerals of students killed in war. I've seen many a one marry, seen many of their children baptized. I've sat in church with tears in my eyes, realizing that I had taught the grandparent of the child, I had taught the parent of the child, and someday, good Lord willing, might eventually teach the child himself. Oh, the churches. The churches. No discussion of Waxhaw is complete without a mention of the churches. We are historically a Scots-Irish town, another stop on the great wagon road that filled the South with Protestants. Bonds Grove, Waxhaw Methodist, Rehoboth, King Memorial, Piney Grove, Round Top, Ebenezer, Bethlehem, Walkersville, Herman, Tirzah. A poetic litany of community within community. And of course, my own beloved Waxhaw Presbyterian. I have spent countless hours in her pews, her committees, her kitchen. I learned to love the church as a very little girl. My Aunt Mag saw to it that I was in church every Sunday that I lived in Pageland. Now, Uncle Elisha, interestingly, was not a churchgoer. He gave land to practically every church around Pageland, but he would not go himself. He was, however, an inveterate student of the Bible. He read the Bible every single day. He'd come to the supper table with tales of all that Paul and Silas had been up to. For ages and ages, I thought he was talking about people he had met in the course of his day. Oh, I was telling you about the campground earlier. In early August, for more than 100 years, families have packed up bag and baggage and moved out to Pleasant Grove Campground for a week. In the old days, I mean the very old days, They would take their cows and chickens with them. I know it seems odd, but how else would they get their milk and eggs? There was no convenience store up the road in Mineral Springs. But then as now, it was a week of visiting and family reunions and religious services every single day. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm not a camp meeting person. Those who love it with all their hearts, but I just don't. I love visiting. I love visiting out there. But I can't bear the thought of packing up everything you can imagine and hauling it 3 miles down the road to stay for a week. Oh, Henry wanted to go out there one year. It was pouring down rain, been raining all week. I said, Henry, it's raining, we'll be stuck in the tent. I'd sooner get all dressed up and go sit in the hall of the barn. Oh, here's a note card with a 3-cent stamp on it. It means I sent it sometime in the late 40s or the early 50s. Oh, June 1948. Dear Susie, finally he has arrived, our new grandbaby. We are very excited. We know our lives are bound to change considerably now that he is here. Congratulations on your new grandchild. Hopefully one of these days, Henrietta and I can ride down to Pageland to see her, and you all can meet Melvin. Well, as you can imagine, that child soon took center stage in our lives. I love to tell him all the stories of Waxhaw, stories I would tell you if I had more time. I'd tell you about the Halloween when some bad boys put a cow in the schoolhouse and made the biggest mess you've ever seen in your life. I'd tell you about the time in 1929 when my father, Henry Collins, got into a duel with R.L. Weir on the main street of Waxhaw. I'd talk to you about the time in 1941 when the Waxhaw School burned down and the Waxhaw Movie Theater opened up. That may not be significant, but it seems that way to me. And of course, I would tell you about all the antique shows that the Waxhaw Women's Club put on. And I'd tell you about the beginnings of the outdoor historical drama Listen and Remember. And I'd tell you about the first Wissackiola Parade in 1965, when it struck me that there was many a person who could manage to climb up on a buggy and parade through town on Saturday afternoon, who could not manage to climb up the steps of the Presbyterian Church on Sunday morning. Finally, what I will tell you is that I am a teacher. It is in the classroom where I have found my purpose and where I have found my joy. Nothing has given me greater pleasure over the years than to run into a former student who remembers being in my class and benefiting from the experience. You see these pretty flowers here? I can't even look at spring flowers without being reminded of a former student. When he came into my 5th grade classroom, he made a bad grade, something that had never happened to him before. He came up to my desk to complain about it, mystified that something as peculiar as a bad grade could have happened to him. I said, listen, you are a cute little boy, but you will find that being in my classroom, being a cute little boy, is not enough. Haskell, you must do the work. And he did, and he thrived. And he became one of my dearest friends in the years after he left my classroom. I have loved all my children. I've tried to uplift and encourage them, to help them discover their potential, to show them that whoever they were or whatever they did, they each had worth as a human being. I know some of them took those lessons to heart. I wish all of them could have. Now, we are going to stop here today. The next time we meet, I want you to bring something to read. A book, a magazine, a chicken feed sack, if that's what interests you. Now, I will come to each of you, and we will sit and read together. I'll read a few words, and you'll read a few words. I'll read a sentence, and you'll read a sentence. And we will continue in that way until we finish whatever it is that you brought. And we will do that every day. And before you know it, you will be an excellent reader, and you will have the whole world in front of you.
Now I'm going to step out for just a minute. While I'm gone, you know what I expect of you. Remember who you are.